Hello and welcome to the Collegian Football Podcast. Ben Ferree, joined by Justin Morganstein. Justin, today we're going to preview Penn State's defense ahead of the blue-white game, or final spring practice as it's this year, tomorrow. That's taking place on Saturday. We're recording this Thursday, but this episode will be out tomorrow on Friday. Anyway, Justin, before we kind of get into things, as we did, Evan and I looked at the offense last week. They will look at the defense. Before we get into it, Justin, how are you doing today?
Ben, we got a football game at Beaver Stadium this weekend. Let's go, baby. Come on now.
There is a football game at Beaver Stadium. Weird place for me not going to be there, as I've handed the reins over to a new football staff. So this is my last football podcast with the Collegian. So bittersweet there after doing this for 2 years, but leaving it in good hands, especially with Justin. Absolutely should be on the podcast next year, as we're still kind of finalizing who the co-host will be, I would imagine there. But yeah, handing the reins over here. So my last podcast experience, but the Penn State defense, what a better note to end it on. Brent Pry's unit coming back. And I mean, traditionally Penn State has a top 10, top 15 defense in the country, especially under Brent Pry and with James Franklin. I mean, he's consistently had one of the best units in the country. I think last year, not so much. And I think that is one of the more underrated storylines from last year that really hasn't gotten that much coverage. I mean, this is just me spouting off here. I mean, I think personally, there was a lot of blame placed on the offense for Penn State's lack of success earlier in the season last year. But when you kind of look at how this defensive unit performed, especially those first 5 games of the season, I mean, they got torched by Maryland, got picked apart by Iowa. I mean, there were just not good performances from this Penn State defense at times last year. So yes, the offense deserved blame for their play, but I think the defense kind of flew under the radar as a unit that didn't really show it in those first couple weeks, and it really showed in the results. And once the defense started to figure it out, I think you saw Penn State start to win and build off that. So this unit is so vital to this Penn State team.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it on the head. Once Micah Parsons announced that he wasn't going to be playing the season, I think that maybe they had to play a little catch up. And I mean, when you have an impact player like that's not in your lineup, it doesn't matter who you're replacing them with at the end of the day. When you have a top 10 pick, your defense is clearly going to be struggling in that area a little bit. And I think we saw that, especially, in terms of getting from sideline to sideline, because we all know the speed that, Micah Parsons presents. But I think that they weren't really expecting that, of course, with COVID and then everything developing so fast. But I think this year they have, maybe a better sense of, what they have. And, probably every team in the country does. And, that's what you hope can improve upon. And James Franklin even said after the season, in terms of transfers, they were going to go after guys defensively. They needed defensive backs. They needed pass rushers. And they did that. They brought in guys like Arnold Ebiketie, whose name I am pronouncing right now. And, guys like Derek Tangelo, too, who's going to play on the interior on the defensive line. So that's where you hope they can improve. And just, knowing that personnel better and getting this spring practice is crucial.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was a big theme when Evan and I talked about the offense, was just kind of in general, Penn State last year had a lot of guys stepping up and playing in roles that they probably didn't expect to be in at that point of the season. And then that coupled with a lack of spring practice, a lack of real summer practice as well. I think you really saw that in the first couple weeks. But as that year, this down year, for a year for Penn State to have it, it's only going to benefit them in the future, as so many young guys were thrust onto the field, got playing time last year, kind of got thrown into the fire. And at times it was messy. It was a bit hard to watch. But now, after having that experience and then a whole spring and summer of practice, I think that's one of the big selling points for Penn State this year, is they're going to be very experienced. And no one lost a year of eligibility because there was no eligibility last year. So you're just having guys basically get a free year. And a lot of these guys for Penn State were sophomores or like redshirt juniors, or like they have multiple years left and they just got a free year basically. So I think Penn State, that's one of their big selling points for me going into this next season, is the experience that they have coming back, and players who were kind of thrown into it. Now they're going to have a whole year to build off of that going into the next year. I mean, that's what you can't learn in spring practice. You can't learn that in summer. You can't get those game reps. So I think that's one of the big selling points for me for Penn State, for this whole team, but especially on the defensive side of the ball. But kind of getting into position, we'll just go position by position. I think we'll start at the defensive line. And you mentioned the transfer portal played a big role this offseason. on the defensive line for John Scott Jr.'s group. I mean, I think when you look at defensive tackle, PJ Mustipher is the biggest returner for this Penn State team. And then Derek Tangelo, the Duke transfer, is likely to slide in that second defensive tackle starting spot. And then you also have names like Akeem Beeman, Fred Hanser, Devon Ellis, Josiah Izzard. I mean, you have decent talent at this defensive line position. I think this is really a strength for Penn State, especially with Derek Tangelo coming in, did good things at Duke. And I think him and Mustipher will be a very, very good combination at defensive tackle.
Yeah, I think that James Franklin sort of nailed it on the head right when the season was over. He said, we're going to need defensive line help next year, because when you lose two guys in Jason Owe and Shaka Toney, those two veteran presences who also obviously had their fair share of production. But, they bring in a guy in Arnold Ebiketie who's going to play on the outside and has plenty of experience being at Temple, and who so far people really seem to think that he's been playing very well in spring practice, according to, the coaches and his teammates. But another guy who transferred in is going to be Derek Tangelo, who should be starting on the inside, has a big presence on the interior and really should line up well next to PJ Mustipher, who's making the transition to nose tackle this year. He talked about that a great deal yesterday. And, I thought it was really interesting. He talked about, last year, a lot of times he felt really frustrated with his own inability to stop the run. And he said, that's something that I used to take, especially like back in high school, even, I used to take a lot of pride in. So he put on, he said, I think over 20 pounds this offseason, looking to really become a run stopper. And that's something that Penn State could have really used, because as we mentioned in the open, they got torched in the run game last year. Like, it was bad. And the inside running east-west, it didn't matter. They just didn't have the quickness or really the size, to combat that. So I think that could definitely be improved. But, honestly, the guy I'm expecting the most from this year is Adisa Isaac. He's someone who, if you can't get excited about him, he has all the physical and athletic traits to not only be good, but PJ Mustipher, or it wasn't PJ Mustipher, actually. I believe it was someone on the defensive line last year was interviewed, I remember, and they said, who's someone that flies under the radar maybe on this unit? And they said, I'll tell you, by the time he's able to get there, Adisa Isaac's going to be a first-round NFL pick. He is 6'4". He is lightning quick on the great hands, and he is everything you really want in a pass rusher. So, and especially learning from some guys like Jason Owe and Shaka Toney last year, that could be huge. I mean, they could have a legitimate first-round pass rusher who's going to be able to develop this year and, continue to provide what he can for that D-line.
No, absolutely. And I think that's what I was going to spend all my time on, talking about Adisa Isaac. And I mean, I think just when you look at the numbers, 6'4", 244 pounds, he has everything you want athletically. Like you said, I mean, last year too, he put up decent production in a non-starting role. I mean, he had 13 tackles, 1.5 sacks, 2 quarterback hurries. I mean, and then you look at a guy like Jason Owe, who, yes, was double teamed a lot in pass rush and that sort of thing. But we talked in our NFL draft preview after the Penn State's Pro Day about how I didn't have any sacks, and everyone made a big deal about that. Adisa Isaac outperformed him statistically in that category last year, and I think he's only going to get better. I'm not going to be surprised when he is a first-round draft pick in the very near future. If he has the year that he could have this year, it will be next spring. He'll be a first-round draft pick. I mean, Adisa Isaac he's so talented, and I think he's kind of always impressed. Even in his true freshman season, he appeared in 11 of Penn State's games. I mean, he has always just had that it factor. You can tell there's a difference when Adisa is out there. He's found a way to stand out in a room that is full of quality talent. I mean, he was getting playing time when he was competing with Shaka Toney, Yetur Gross-Matos. I mean, he was still getting playing time in that time period. So I think Adisa Isaac, I expect him to have a massive season. I would say give him 6 sacks in the fall. I think that's my hot take. Just throwing it out there. But I think Adisa Isaac will have a real breakout season.
Yeah, I think if we learned anything from Jason Owe last year, it's that athleticism, size, physicality, hand skills, when you have all those things, it comes pretty easy, honestly. And he's just a guy who in his press conference yesterday, he almost has a Jahan Dotson like mentality of where everyone says he's so quiet, But, when they all see him going about his business, just doing his thing, he doesn't even have to speak to lead. Like, it makes everyone want to step up their game. When you see someone like that, or like even when we talked about after the pro day, when you're competing against a Micah Parsons, a Jason Owa, that type of athlete, you're always going to want to compete with that. And I think that's what's going to happen this year. And the coaches are absolutely raving about him. They love him.
Absolutely. And then we got to kind of move back to the linebacker position. I mean, we talked about it in the opening segment about how the loss of Micah Parsons last year to opting out really kind of threw this unit for a bit of a loop at times. A lot of young guys stepping up into big roles. And overall, I think it was, like we mentioned earlier, a bit rough the first couple of weeks. But as the season went on, guys like Brandon Smith, Curtis Jacobs, they really kind of grew into these roles that they carved out. And we really saw a lot better from them. But this year, to kind of preview it, looks like starters are going to be Brandon Smith, Curtis Jacobs, and Jesse Luketa as the linebacker 3 for Penn State. Then you also have Ellis Brooks, Charlie Katcher getting big playing time in there as well. But it'll be interesting to see this linebacker group. And again, I think pure raw talent. I mean, Brandon Smith just stands out as a guy who every year he has at least one hit that you just hear in the press box. You're like, whoo. He's shown that plenty of times already. But I think there's a lot of optimism for this linebacker group. I think there is a little bit of question marks with Luketa. Didn't have the best season in 2020 and is definitely one of the older guys, but he does bring that veteran leadership that this group probably does need. But I think you should expect to see big things from Brandon Smith, Curtis Jacobs in 2021.
Yeah, what I've heard about Brandon Smith is he is trying to make the transition from outside to Mike linebacker and to play in all those sub packages like nickel and just be more of a 3-down back or 3-down linebacker, excuse me. And I think that what's really important about that is he is a guy that can get sideline to sideline. We saw as much of a good leader as Jesse Luketa is, and how I think he's a really important player for Penn State. A guy like him who is not as fast as, more of an old school type linebacker is someone who's not going to be as effective in modern day Big Ten just because of all these ridiculous athletes. And a guy like you said, like Brandon Smith, you could see his speed immediately. Like he is someone who has all the athletic traits that you would want in a linebacker. And that's really exciting for Penn State. And he is a guy who really can fill that role that Micah Parsons kind of played 2 years ago. Obviously, you can't expect what Micah did. I mean, he had an unbelievable season. But Brandon Smith's a guy who can develop into that type of player. And I think it's going to be really interesting just to see that transition. And he should be on the field all the time. I think that's why they're making the decision to, transition him to a Mike linebacker a little more.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it'll be interesting to see just the development from guys like Brandon Smith, from Curtis Jacobs, especially having all of this time to prepare. It'll be interesting to see what their ceiling is and kind of how they're different from 2020. I mean, that's one of the things right now is we don't get to see it on like a weekly basis, or really don't get to see a lot of progress because we don't get to go into practices or anything because of COVID. So I think it'll be really interesting to see just how big of a difference there is in guys like that. But this is also a pretty deep unit as well. I mean, I think the Penn State linebacker group, there's a lot of room for optimism when you just kind of look across the board at it. I think, again, just because of a lot of young people played last year, and there's going to be a lot of returning experience there.
Yeah, you kind of just hit it. I was going to say, with Micah being out last year, there were guys that got those chances that weren't going to get those chances previously. And I mean, obviously it didn't help last year, but now it certainly makes your group a lot deeper. And having a guy like Ellis Brooks be able to have in a rotation is something that's really important. And, rotating guys in and out of the field is, especially with this year, with it being, a longer season than last year, who knows with injuries, and having that extra guy for depth is really going to be important. So an experienced guy like Ellis Brooks to have off the bench is going to be definitely something good.
No, absolutely. I think Ellis Brooks is a guy who he could start for a lot of linebacker rooms in the Big Ten in the country. So, I mean, like you said, having a guy like that in the rotation, absolutely massive for this group. Now, we'll kind of take it back one step further. We'll talk about the cornerbacks. We'll split cornerbacks and safety. We don't want to go secondary as a whole because there's definitely a lot of talking points here. But when you look at the Penn State cornerbacks, this is a group that Penn State has seemingly the last 5 years or so always had issues at the cornerback position. It's kind of always seemed like a weakness, an area where if there's somewhere to blame on the Penn State defense for some big losses, it sometimes falls in the secondary, blown coverages, whatever. But kind of looking at this cornerback room going into 2021, I mean, I think it's headlined by Tariq Castro-Fields, the decision to come back after being injured the last season. And then lining up across from him, you're going to have Joey Porter Jr., who was exceptional in 2020. You guys have got, or 2020, you guys have Keaton Ellis as well. I think there's a lot of room for optimism in this Penn State cornerback room. And for once, I think this does kind of fall, though, on how will Tariq Castro-Fields perform. Because I know last spring he talked a lot about wanting to prove he's a first-round NFL draft pick last season. Didn't happen injury-wise. So, I mean, he obviously still has that chip on his shoulder, but where is his ceiling at this point, returning off of injury? How good does Tariq Castro-Fields play, I think, is really going to determine the ceiling of this unit. Because this cornerback unit, if Tariq Castro-Fields does play like that first-round draft pick with guys like Joey Porter Jr., with guys like Keaton Ellis behind him, this cornerback room would be one of the best in the Big Ten, if not the country. It could have that potential. It's just going to kind of determine how Castro-Fields plays in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen with Tariq Castro-Fields, he's always had, the body, the physical traits that you would look for in a good cornerback, but just, the skills in space and, just in man coverage at times, he can, get a little lost. But I think having his experience back is something that's important for this defense. And to me, he's your number 2 corner too. Joey Porter Jr. was a stud this year, to put it simply. He was awesome in man zone. When he dropped back in coverage, he was in space great. And I think you can expect to see even another step from him this year. He's in recent memory, I can't really remember a cornerback that after a freshman season, you could feel that good about at Penn State. So this is an area where I'm thinking this is going to be the best they've had in a little while. That's a strong top 2 if they can stay healthy, of course.
Yeah, so I think one concern with this unit was last year they just accounted for 1 interception, and it came from Keaton Ellis in the last game of the year against Illinois. I think that's a cause for concern. This unit has to force some turnovers if Penn State wants to go where wants to achieve their goals this season. I think so. That's something I think that's something that Castro-Fields has talked about, where that's where he needs to take his next step, is really in becoming a game-changing player. And I think that's something, just to kind of go off that point, I think it's something Penn State secondary in general, not just the cornerback room, has struggled with in these last couple of years. Is they haven't had that player that can really change a game, alter a game. You think of a Micah Parsons, for example, in the Cotton Bowl. He took over the game. He just absolutely took over that game. That was his game. And obviously it's easier to do from a linebacker position or from a defensive end position where you're constantly pass rushing or can fill gaps in the run game or that sort of thing. But Penn State really hasn't had a guy in the secondary take over a game, be a game-changing player. I think that's something that is a little cause for concern. They have to force more turnovers this year. They have to.
Yeah, was that interception last year? I was just trying to look it up. Was that the one where they picked it off against Michigan State and they gave it right back?
That might have been against Michigan State.
I might have misspoke there. I remember that, because I think he picked it off and then on the return fumbled it and gave it back to Michigan State. So that was their one interception last year.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so it, like you said, the turnover battle is going to be huge. Franklin always preaches ball possession, as does every coach. But just being able to help the offense out, because in a year last year where they really could have used the help, it would have been nice maybe to give Sean Clifford a couple short fields every once in a while. So obviously it goes both ways, as we said, offensively and defensively. But their job, like you said, is to find the ball and make a play on it. And with that simply has to be better this year. And Tariq Castro-Fields, I'm sure in what is this, year 5 or 6 for him at Penn State now, he is going to be taking a lot of that responsibility on himself. So, I hope he has a great year, and I'm honestly hopeful for the group, but we'll see if they can, get those numbers up, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I think expectations are going to be raised this year, especially when you have a guy like Joey Porter Jr. who performed like he did last year. I think expectations are naturally going to go up heading into 2021. So we'll see if that group can live up to it as the first year that they've had expectations in a while. Now, kind of moving on to our last position of the defense here, look at the safety position, which is where one of the few areas on the Penn State roster really that is a big question mark, an area where there is some position battling going on. I mean, because you think about it, for the most part, this Penn State roster is pretty set in its depth chart for the most part. I mean, I think there's a couple people here and there. There's a couple questions in the offensive line. You know, things can always change rotation wise. There's a little bit of questions defense line. For the most part, there isn't too much position battling going on. But the safety position, I mean, I think this is a group that is pretty wide open. I mean, I think you're going to have Jaquan Brisker, who's coming off of just an exceptional 2020 season, made the decision to come back again, even though he would have been, third round pick probably in the NFL draft. And he was one of the highest graded safeties in the country by PFF consistently week in, week out. Just unbelievable season. I think if there's, going back to my last point, coming from Lackawanna College, Brisker, I mean, I think if there is a player on the Penn State defense that could kind of take over and be a game changer, especially in the secondary, it could be Brisker. He has that potential. He showed it last year with his ability. But then when you look at the rest of the safety position, I think is it going to be Jonathan Sutherland? Is it going to be Jair Brown in the other starting role? Or could we see someone like a Tyler Rudolph possibly, or an Enzo Jennings coming in as a freshman? I think who's going to be that other safety alongside Brisker is going to be the big question.
Yeah, so obviously, you're getting with Brisker. He's going to be in the box. He's going to stop the run. He's going to, play in those compact areas, compact spaces. And then you have the battle, it seems, between Jair Brown and Jonathan Sutherland. And to me, I feel like at this point, this is probably Jair Brown's job to lose, because Jonathan Sutherland, I think we've seen him at safety a bunch, and his ability to play in space, especially with a guy like Brisker, who's definitely going to be loaded in the box much more, it kind of concerns you a little bit. I mean, he's an awesome special teams player, great leader. And to me, I don't see any reason to, take him out of that role necessarily when you have a guy in Jair Brown who is really good athletic traits. And I think, and also him and Jaquan Brisker would be the Lackawanna defensive backfield, which he talked about yesterday, which I'm sure would be cool for them and the coaches there too. But they've raved about Enzo Jennings. They've said all the right things about him. We just haven't really been able to see him over between COVID and his injuries. And I really, this weekend should be interesting to see, what he does. But, they have been raving about him. So we'll see what he's got. But for now, to me, this is Jair Brown's job to lose.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think when you look at Jonathan Sutherland, I think ideally you'd want him more in the same exact role that Brisker's going to play. So I think coverage wise, that's going to be very, very tough to have him more as that pass coverage safety. And I think, like you said, Jair Brown fits that mold a lot better athletic wise. And I think Jonathan Sutherland is going to see time at safety this year. I mean, I think that's obvious, but I mean, I think he's really carved out a good set role in what he does on special teams and just being a leader throughout the team. I mean, I think he kind of has his role, kind of has his spot carved out, so to say. And I'm not saying that Sutherland couldn't step up, become that bigger pass cover safety, but I think what we've seen from Jair Brown from last year and everything, just athletically, I think he will fit that role better. I'm excited to see what Enzo Jennings does, how he grows from last year. I mean, of course, we only saw him against Illinois kind of in garbage time last year, so we didn't really get to see him really play at all, really, but was a 4-star prospect coming out of high school, one of the top ranked safeties, one of the top ranked players in Michigan kind of coming out of high school. So I think he's really going to be interesting to see how see if he'll definitely get some playing time this year, I would imagine. But the safety group in general, I mean, I think it's the biggest question mark, I would say, on this team. I think we know what Jaquan Brisker is going to give you. I think there is question marks there with what will Jair Brown and Jonathan Sutherland do. Will it be enough in pass defense? I think you could see more corner heavy packages because of that this year on the Penn State defense. But I think if there is a big question mark weakness on the roster on a position basis, I would say it probably is the safety position for Penn State. It's just unproven at this point. I think they have the talent. It's just, like I said, it's unproven.
I will say though, with Brisker, it opens up a lot of stuff for them. Like with him solidified, playing that sort of nickel in the box role that, so many NFL safeties play now. Like you look at a Malcolm Jenkins, and that's a real comparison you can make. And just if Jair Brown or any of them, Sutherland, doesn't matter, can step up in coverage and, really start to lock down that role, then to me, the position's kind of solidified. I mean, it really depends on that, if that one safety can find a way to step up or not.
No, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think someone will grow into that role. I think that's absolutely going to happen. It might take Penn State a little bit to find it, but that they will eventually figure out that other position. Now, something that's tough for them is their schedule to start next season. Is there's not going to be a lot of time to figure out who's going to be that guy in game time. It's going to have to kind of happen right away. But I think you will see some rotation as well, just kind of throughout the year.
The thing, Wisconsin doesn't throw the ball.
Yeah, well, yeah, you'll want two safeties in the box against Wisconsin, as they have 12 offensive linemen on the field. But kind of just moving on to the defense as a whole, as we kind of wrap up this episode, I think I kind of teased it at the start that I think last year, especially from my point of view, was kind of critical of this Penn State defense. And I think, yes, they were put into a lot of bad situations by the Penn State offense, but I think there was times where they could have been better and they flat out needed to be better. So I think, Justin, what would you say just kind of overall this defense needs to improve on, just need to kind of figure out in this 2021 season to avoid what happened last year, to be better than that performance last year?
Yeah. Before I get into it a little, I think it was the Maryland game. I just remember it was the jet sweep and it got handed off maybe like 2-3 times and they got beat on it every single play. I just felt they were always chasing somebody down the field. Like, you got to keep guys in front of you this year. And whether that's with speed, whether that's with size, keeping guys in front of you and eliminating the big play is so, so crucial. Last year, they would just get down in the first quarter and the wheels would just start falling off the tracks. Like, you got to get big stops early. And these are things that, Brent Pry has talked about, postseason, and all the specialty position coaches as well. And just avoiding that big play, and also just finding a way to keep your team in the game. Like last year, obviously the offense didn't have its best year, but, having the offense get those stops and getting turnovers like we just talked about, it just makes the whole outlook so much better. And, if they can just make those big plays and eliminate big plays, that's going to be the key.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, take down those explosive plays. And we watched the Maryland game going up against more of a spread offense. Like you mentioned, they just got destroyed on jet sweeps, RPOs, simple systems. Tylea just picked them apart. But then you look a couple weeks later, they play Iowa, who's completely different style offense, more ground and pound, and they got equally embarrassed in that game. So, I think there's just some looks for this defense. You have to figure that out. They need to cause turnovers this year. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is causing turnovers. But like you said, it's just keeping people in front of you, figuring out those matchups, just not getting bullied at times is something that this defense, this is such an old school take, but I think they need to play a little nastier. And I think you didn't see that early in the season. They got their swagger back by the end of the year. So I think that's something that they need to play like they're a top 10 defense, normally perennial, year in, year out, every year. They need to have that swagger. They didn't have that at all at the beginning of the year. They looked a bit lost at times. So cause some turnovers, have that swagger, and those two go together. And like you said, cutting down on big plays, that sort of thing, they all run together. So I think that's the big key for this Penn State defense is just obviously like do your job and everything, but it's get that sack, get that tackle for a loss, force that fumble, just things like that, momentum shifting plays, especially if your offense is having a bad game, a forced fumble or something like that can flip momentum fully. And that could be what the offense needs to kind of get it kicked in gear and going. I think overall, you just need to see that Penn State defense play with their swagger again. And they got it back at the end of the year. I would expect them to come out in full force with it game one against Wisconsin. But it'll definitely be interesting to see kind of where they go. But for me, just big explosive plays, whether it's turnovers or just sacks, tackles for losses, just things like that in general.
Yeah, I mean, you could have ran a simulation of the season maybe 100 times last year. I don't know if Jason Owen doesn't get a sack once. Like that just
Yeah.
Sometimes I hate to blame unluckiness sometimes, but that stuff like that I feel like it's not going to happen this year. Especially you talked about getting the swagger back, and this kind of just brings everything full circle. They didn't have that once Michael Parsons left. Like that was their heart and soul. Like so finding that kind of on the fly when there was no preseason practice or real football bonding activities even that you saw that, and that's something where you have to feel a little more optimistic this year just in terms of chemistry between defenders and really having a mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Collegian Football Podcast. Justin, thanks for joining me in my final episode. Big day for me as I get ready to graduate. But hope you enjoyed this episode where we kind of looked at the defense, kind of previewed the whole team. Now at this point, heading into the blue-white / spring practice scrimmage game that's happening on Saturday, tomorrow, when this episode comes out. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, stay tuned to the Collegian for all of your Penn State football coverage at our website, collegian.psu.edu. Follow us on Twitter at PSU Footblog and subscribe on YouTube. Thanks for listening in.